Chapter 22 of The Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 22. Charlie's Adventures with Savages and Bears. Trapping Life. It is one thing to chase a horse. It is another thing to catch it. Little consideration and less sagacity is required to convince us of the truth of that fact. The reader may perhaps venture to think this rather a trifling fact. We are not so sure of that. In this world of fancies, to have any fact incontestably proved and established is a comfort, and whatever is a source of comfort to mankind is worthy of notice. Surely our reader won't deny that. Perhaps he will, so we can only console ourselves with the remark that there are people in this world who would deny anything, who would deny that there was a nose on their face if you said there was. Well, to return to the point, which was the chase of a horse in the abstract, from which we will rapidly diverge to the chase of Dick Varley's horse in particular. This noble charger, having been ridden by savages until all his old fire and blood and mettle were worked up to a red heat, no sooner discovered that he was pursued than he gave a snort of defiance, which he accompanied with a frantic shake of his mane, and a fling of contempt, in addition to a magnificent wave of his tail. Then he thundered up the valley at a pace which would speedily have left Joe Blunt and Henry out of sight behind, if that's the word, if. What a word that if is. What a world of ifs we live in. There never was anything that wouldn't have been something else if something hadn't intervened to prevent it. Yes, we repeat, Charlie would have left his two friends miles and miles behind in what is called no time, if he had not run straight into a gorge which was surrounded by inaccessible precipices, and out of which there was no exit except by the entrance, which was immediately barred by Henry, while Joe advanced to catch the runaway. For 2 hours at least did Joe Blunt essay to catch Charlie, and during that space of time he utterly failed. The horse seemed to have made up his mind for what is vulgarly termed a lark. "It won't do, Henry," said Joe, advancing towards his companion and wiping his forehead with the cuff of his leather coat. "I can't catch him. The wind's almost blowed out of me body." "Dat am vexatiable," replied Henry in a tone of commiseration. "S'pose I was make try?" "In that case I suppose ye would fail. But go ahead and do what you can. I'll hold your horse." So Henry began by a rush and a flourish of legs and arms that nearly frightened the horse out of his wits. For half an hour he went through all the complications of running and twisting of which he was capable, without success, when Joe Blunt suddenly uttered a stentorian yell that rooted him to the spot on which he stood. To account for this, we must explain that in the heights of the Rocky Mountains vast accumulations of snow take place among the crevices and gorges during the winter. Such of these masses as form on steep slopes are loosened by occasional thaws, and are precipitated in the form of avalanches into the valleys below, carrying trees and stones along with them in their thundering descent. In the gloomy gorge where Dick's horse had taken refuge, the precipices were so steep that many avalanches had occurred, as was evident from the mounds of heaped snow that lay at the foot of most of them. Neither stones nor trees were carried down here, however, for the cliffs were nearly perpendicular, and the snow slipping over their edges had fallen on the grass below. Such an avalanche was now about to take place, and it was this that caused Joe to utter his cry of alarm and warning. Henry and the horse were directly under the cliff over which it was about to be hurled, the latter close to the wall of rock, the other at some distance away from it. Joe cried again, "Back, Henry!" when the mass flowed over and fell with a roar like prolonged thunder. Henry sprang back in time to save his life, though he was knocked down and almost stunned. But poor Charlie was completely buried under the avalanche, which now presented the appearance of a hill of snow. The instant Henry recovered sufficiently, Joe and he mounted their horses and galloped back to the camp as fast as possible. Meanwhile, another spectator stepped forward upon the scene they had left and surveyed the snow hill with a critical eye. This was no less than a grizzly bear, which had, unobserved, been a spectator, and which immediately proceeded to dig into the mound with the purpose, no doubt, of disentombing the carcass of the horse for purposes of his own. While he was thus actively engaged, the two hunters reached the camp, where they found that Pierre and his party had just arrived. The men sent out in search of them had scarcely advanced a mile, when they found them trudging back to the camp in a very disconsolate manner. But all their sorrows were put to flight on hearing of the curious way in which the horses had been returned to them with interest. Scarcely had Dick Varley, however, congratulated himself on the recovery of his gallant steed, when he was thrown into despair by the sudden arrival of Joe, with tidings of the catastrophe we have just related. Of course, there was a general rush to the rescue. Only a few men were ordered to remain to guard the camp, while the remainder mounted their horses and galloped toward the gorge where Charlie had been entombed. On arriving, they found that Bruin had worked with such laudable zeal that nothing but the tip of his tail was seen sticking out of the hole which he had dug. The hunters could not refrain from laughing as they sprang to the ground, and standing in a semicircle in front of the hole, prepared to fire. But Crusoe resolved to have the honor of leading the assault. He seized fast hold of Bruin's flank, and caused his teeth to meet therein. Caleb backed out at once and turned round, but before he could recover from his surprise, a dozen bullets pierced his heart and brain. "Now, lads," cried Cameron, setting to work with a large wooden shovel, "work like negroes. If there's any life left in the horse, it'll soon be smothered out unless we set him free." The men needed no urging, however. They worked as if their lives depended on their exertions. Dick Varley, in particular, labored like a young Hercules, and Henry hurled masses of snow about in a most surprising manner. Crusoe, too, entered heartily into the spirit of the work, and, scraping with his forepaws, sent such a continuous shower of snow behind him that he was speedily lost to view in a hole of his own excavating. In the course of half an hour, a cavern was dug in the mound almost close up to the cliff, and the men were beginning to look about for the crushed body of Dick's steed, when an exclamation from Henry attracted their attention. "Ha! mes amis, here am be one hole." The truth of this could not be doubted, for the eccentric trapper had thrust his shovel through the wall of snow into what appeared to be a cavern beyond, and immediately followed up his remark by thrusting his head and shoulders. He drew them out in a few seconds with a look of intense amazement. "Voila, Joe Blunt! Look in there, and you shall see fat you will behold." "Why, it's the horse, I do believe," cried Joe. "Go ahead, lads." So saying, he resumed his shoveling vigorously, and in a few minutes the hole was opened up sufficiently to enable a man to enter. Dick sprang in, and there stood Charlie close beside the cliff, looking as sedate and unconcerned as if all that had been going on had no reference to him whatever. The cause of his safety was simple enough. The precipice beside which he stood when the avalanche occurred overhung its base at that point considerably, so that when the snow descended, a clear space of several feet wide was left all along its base. Here Charlie remained in perfect comfort until his friends dug him out. Congratulating themselves not a little on having saved the charger and bagged a grizzly bear, the trappers remounted and returned to the camp. For some time after this, nothing worthy of particular note occurred. The trapping operations went on prosperously and without interruption from the Indians, who seemed to have left the locality altogether. During this period, Dick and Crusoe and Charlie had many excursions together, and the silver rifle full many a time sent death to the heart of a bear, and elk, and buffalo, while indirectly it sent joy to the heart of man, woman, and child in camp in the shape of juicy steaks and marrow bones. Joe and Henry devoted themselves almost exclusively to trapping beaver, in which pursuit they were so successful that they speedily became wealthy men, according to backwood notions of wealth. With the beaver that they caught they purchased from Cameron's store powder and shot enough for a long hunting expedition and a couple of spare horses to carry their packs. They also purchased a large assortment of goods and trinkets as would prove acceptable to Indians, and supplied themselves with new blankets and a few pairs of strong moccasins, of which they stood much in need. Thus they went on from day to day, until symptoms of the approach of winter warned them that it was time to return to the Mustang Valley. About this time an event occurred which totally changed the aspect of affairs in these remote valleys of the Rocky Mountains, and precipitated the departure of our four friends, Dick, Joe, Henry, and Crusoe. This was the sudden arrival of a whole tribe of Indians. As their advent was somewhat remarkable, we shall devote to it the commencement of a new chapter. Chapter 23. Of Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 23. Savage Sports. Living Cataracts. An Alarm. Indians and their Doings. The Stampedo. Charlie again. One day Dick Varley was out on a solitary hunting expedition near the Rocky Gorge, where his horse had received temporary burial a week or two before. Crusoe was with him, of course. Dick had tied Charlie to a tree, and was sunning himself on the edge of a cliff, from the top of which he had a fine view of the valley and the rugged precipices that hemmed it in. Just in front of the spot on which he sat, the precipices on the opposite side of the gorge rose to a considerable height above him, so that their ragged outlines were drawn sharply across the clear sky. Dick was gazing in dreamy silence at the jutting rocks and dark caverns, and speculating on the probable number of bears that dwelt there, when a slight degree of restlessness on the part of Crusoe attracted him. "What is it, pup?" said he, laying his hand on the dog's broad back. Crusoe looked the answer. "I don't know, Dick, but it's something, you may depend on it, else I would not have disturbed you." Dick lifted his rifle from the ground and laid it in the hollow of his left arm. "There must be something in the wind," remarked Dick. As wind is known to be composed of two distinct gases, Crusoe felt perfectly safe in replying "yes" with his tail. Immediately after he added, "Hallo, did you hear that?" with his ears. Dick did hear it, and sprang hastily to his feet, as a sound like, yet unlike, distant thunder came faintly down upon the breeze. In a few seconds the sound increased to a roar, in which was mingled the wild cries of men. Neither Dick nor Crusoe moved, for the sounds came from behind the heights in front of them, and they felt that the only way to solve the question, "What can the sounds be?" was to wait till the sounds should solve it themselves. Suddenly the muffled sounds gave place to the distinct bellowing of cattle, the clatter of innumerable hoofs, the yells of savage men, while at the same moment the edges of the opposite cliffs became alive with Indians and buffaloes, rushing about in frantic haste, the former almost mad with savage excitement, the latter with blind rage and terror. On reaching the edge of the dizzy precipice, the buffaloes turned abruptly and tossed their ponderous heads as they coursed along the edge. Yet a few of them, unable to check their headlong course, fell over and were dashed to pieces on the rocks below. Such falls, Dick observed, were hailed with shouts of delight by the Indians, whose sole object evidently was to enjoy the sport of driving the terrified animals over the precipice. The wily savages had chosen their ground well for this purpose. The cliff immediately opposite to Dick Varley was a huge projection from the precipice that hemmed in the gorge, or species of cape or promontory several hundred yards wide at the base, and narrowing abruptly to a point. The sides of this wedge-shaped projection were quite perpendicular. Indeed, in some places the top overhung the base, and they were at least 300 feet high. Broken and jagged rocks, of that peculiarly chaotic character which probably suggested the name to this part of the great American chain, projected from and were scattered all around the cliffs. Over these the Indians, whose numbers increased every moment, strove to drive the luckless herd of buffaloes that had chanced to fall in their way. The task was easy. The unsuspecting animals, of which there were hundreds, rushed in a dense mass upon the cape referred to. On they came with irresistible impetuosity, bellowing furiously, while their hoofs thundered on the turf with muffled continuous roar of a distant but mighty cataract, the Indians, meanwhile, urging them on by a hideous yell and frantic gesture. The advance guard came bounding madly to the edge of the precipice. Here they stopped short, and gazed affrighted at the gulf below. It was but for a moment. The irresistible momentum of the flying mass behind pushed them over. Down they came, absolutely a living cataract, upon the rocks below. Some struck on the projecting rocks in the descent, and their bodies were dashed almost in pieces, while their blood spurted out in showers. Others leaped from rock to rock with awful bounds, until, losing their foothold, they fell headlong, while others descended sheer down into the sweltering mass that lay shattered at the base of the cliffs. Dick Varley and his dog remained rooted to the rock as they gazed at the sickening sight as if petrified. Scarce 50 of that noble herd of buffaloes escaped the awful leap, but they escaped only to fall before the arrows of their ruthless pursuers. Dick had often heard of this tendency of the Indians, where buffaloes were very numerous, to drive them over precipices in mere wanton sport and cruelty, but he had never seen it until now, and the sight filled his soul with horror. It was not until the din and tumult of the perishing herd and the shrill yells of the Indians had almost died away that he turned to quit the spot, but the instant he did so another shout was raised. The savages had observed him, and were seen galloping along the cliffs towards the head of the gorge, with the obvious intention of gaining the other side and capturing him. Dick sprang on Charlie's back, and the next instant was flying down the valley towards the camp. He did not, however, fear being overtaken, for the gorge could not be crossed, and the way round the head of it was long and rugged, but he was anxious to alarm the camp as quickly as possible, so that they might have time to call in the more distant trappers and make preparations for defense. "Where away now, youngster?" inquired Cameron, emerging from his tent, as Dick, taking the brook that flowed in front at a flying leap, came crashing through the bushes into the midst of the fur packs at full speed. "Injuns!" ejaculated Dick, reining up and vaulting out of the saddle. "Hundreds of 'em! Fiends incarnate, every one!" "Are they near?" "Yes, an hour'll bring them down on us. Are Joe and Henry far from camp to day?" "At 10 Mile Creek," replied Cameron, with an expression of bitterness, as he caught his gun up and shouted to several men who hurried up on seeing our heroes burst into camp. 10 Mile Creek, muttered Dick. "I'll bring 'em in, though," he continued, glancing at several of the camp horses that grazed close at hand. In another moment he was on Charlie's back. The line of one of the best horses was in his hand, and almost before Cameron knew what he was about, he was flying down the valley like the wind. Charlie often stretched out at full speed to please his young master, but seldom had he been urged forward as he was upon this occasion. The led horse, being light and wild, kept well up, and in a marvellously short space of time they were at 10 Mile Creek. "Hello, Dick! What's to do?" inquired Joe Blunt, who was up to his knees in the water, setting a trap at the moment his friend galloped up. "Injuns! Where's Henry?" demanded Dick. "At the head of the dam there." Dick was off in a moment, and almost instantly returned with Henry galloping beside him. No word was spoken. In a time of action these men did not waste words. During Dick's momentary absence, Joe Blunt had caught up his rifle and examined the priming, so that when Dick pulled up beside him he merely laid his hands on the saddle, saying, "All right," as he vaulted on Charlie's back behind his young companion. In another moment they were away at full speed. The mustang seemed to feel that unwonted exertions were required of him. Double weighted though he was, he kept well up with the other horse, and in less than 2 hours after Dick's leaving the camp the three hunters came in sight of it. Meanwhile Cameron had collected nearly all his forces and put his camp in a state of defense before the Indians arrived, which they did suddenly, and as usual at full gallop, to the amount of at least 200. They did not at first seem disposed to hold friendly intercourse with the trappers, but assembled in a semicircle round the camp in a menacing attitude, while one of their chiefs stepped forward to hold a palaver. For some time the conversation on both sides was polite enough, but by degrees the Indian chief assumed an imperious tone, and demanded gifts from the trappers, taking care to enforce his request by hinting that thousands of his countrymen were not far distant. Cameron stoutly refused, and the palaver threatened to come to an abrupt and unpleasant termination just at the time that Dick and his friends appeared on the scene of action. The brook was cleared at a bound. The three hunters leaped from their steeds and sprang to the front with a degree of energy that had a visible effect on the savages; and Cameron, seizing the moment, proposed that the two parties should smoke a pipe and hold a council. The Indians agreed, and in a few minutes they were engaged in animated and friendly intercourse. The speeches were long, and the compliments paid on either side were inflated, and, we fear, undeserved; but the result of the interview was, that Cameron made the Indians a present of tobacco and a few trinkets, and sent them back to their friends to tell them that he was willing to trade with them. Next day the whole tribe arrived in the valley, and pitched their deerskin tents on the plain opposite to the camp of the white men. Their numbers far exceeded Cameron's expectation, and it was with some anxiety that he proceeded to strengthen his fortifications as much as circumstances and the nature of the ground would admit. The Indian camp, which numbered upwards of 1,000 souls, was arranged with great regularity, and was divided into 3 distinct sections, each section being composed of a separate tribe. The Great Snake Nation at that time embraced 3 tribes or divisions, namely the Shirry Dikas, or dog eaters, the War-are-ree-kas, or fish eaters, and the Banattees, or robbers. These were the most numerous and powerful Indians on the west side of the Rocky Mountains. The Shirry Dikas dwelt in the plains, and hunted the buffaloes, dressed well, were clean, rich in horses, bold, independent, and good warriors. The War-are-ree-kas lived chiefly by fishing, and were found on the banks of the rivers and lakes throughout the country. They were more corpulent, slovenly, and indolent than the Shirry Dikas, and more peaceful. The Banattees, as we have before mentioned, were the robbers of the mountains. They were a wild and contemptible race, and at enmity with every one. In summer they went about nearly naked. In winter they clothed themselves in the skin of rabbits and wolves. Being excellent mimics, they could imitate the howling of wolves, the neighing of horses, and the cries of birds, by which means they could approach travelers, rob them, and then fly to their rocky fastnesses in the mountains, where pursuit was vain. Such were the men who now assembled in front of the camp of the fur traders, and Cameron soon found that the news of his presence in the country had spread far and wide among the natives, bringing them to the neighborhood of his camp in immense crowds, so that, during the next few days, their numbers increased to thousands. Several long palavers quickly ensued between the red men and the white, and the 2 great chiefs who seemed to hold despotic rule over the assembled tribes were extremely favorable to the idea of universal peace which was propounded to them. In several set speeches of great length and very considerable power, these natural orators explained their willingness to enter into amicable relations with all the surrounding nations as well as with the white men. "But," said Pee-eye-em, the chief of the Shirry Dikas, a man above 6 feet high and of immense muscular strength, But my tribe cannot answer for the Banattees, who are robbers and cannot be punished because they dwell in scattered families among the mountains. The Banattees are bad. They cannot be trusted." None of the Banattees were present at the council when this was said, and if they had been, it would have mattered little, for they were neither fierce nor courageous, although bold enough in their own haunts to murder and rob the unwary. The second chief did not quite agree with Pee-eye-em. He said that it was impossible for them to make peace with their natural enemies, the Piegans and the Blackfeet on the east side of the mountains. It was very desirable, he admitted, but neither of these tribes would consent to it, he felt sure. Upon this, Joe Blunt rose and said, "The great chief of the War-are-ree-kas is wise, and knows that enemies cannot be reconciled unless deputies are sent to make proposals of peace." "The pale-face does not know the Blackfeet," answered the chief. "Who will go into the lands of the Blackfeet? My young men have been sent out once again, and their scalps are now fringes to the leggings of their enemies. The War-are-ree-kas do not cross the mountains but for the purpose of making war." "The chief speaks the truth," returned Joe. "Yet there are 3 men round the council fire who will go to the Blackfeet and the Piegans with a message of peace from the Snakes, if they wish it." Joe pointed to himself, Henry, and Dick as he spoke, and added, "We 3 do not belong to the camp of the fur traders. We only lodge with them for a time. The great chief of the white men has sent us to make peace with the red men, and to tell them that he desires to trade with them, to exchange hatchets and guns and blankets for furs." This declaration interested the 2 chiefs greatly, and after a good deal of discussion, they agreed to take advantage of Joe Blunt's offer and appoint him as a deputy to the court of their enemies. Having arranged these matters to their satisfaction, Cameron bestowed a red flag and a blue surtout, with brass buttons on each of the chiefs, and a variety of smaller articles on the other members of the council, and sent them away in a particularly amiable frame of mind. Pee-eye-em burst the blue surtout at the shoulders and elbows in putting it on, as it was much too small for his gigantic frame, but never having seen such an article of apparel before, he either regarded this as the natural and proper consequence of putting it on, or was totally indifferent to it, for he merely looked at the rents with a smile of satisfaction, while his squaw surreptitiously cut off the 2 back buttons and thrust them into her bosom. By the time the council closed, the night was far advanced, and a bright moon was shedding a flood of soft light over the picturesque and busy scene. "I'll go to the Injun camp," said Joe to Walter Cameron, as the chiefs rose to depart. "The season's far enough advanced already. It's time to be off, and if I'm to speak for the Redskins in the Blackfeet Council, I need to know what to say."
"Please yourself, Master Blunt," answered Cameron. "I like your company and that of your friends, and if it suited you, I would be glad to take you along with us to the coast of the Pacific. But your mission among the Indians is a good one, and I'll help it on all I can. I suppose you will go also?" he added, turning to Dick Varley, who was still seated beside the council fire caressing Crusoe. "Wherever Joe goes, I go," answered Dick. Crusoe's tail, ears, and eyes demonstrated high approval of the sentiment involved in this speech. "And your friend Henry?"
"He goes too," answered Joe. "It's as well that the Redskins should see the 3 of us before we start for the east side of the mountains. Ho, Henry, come here, lad."
Henry obeyed, and in a few seconds the 3 friends crossed the brook to the Indian camp, and were guided to the principal lodge by Pee-eye-em. Here a great council was held, and the proposed attempt at negotiations for peace with their ancient enemies fully discussed. While they were thus engaged, and just as Pee-eye-em had, in the energy of an enthusiastic peroration, burst the blue surtout almost up to the collar, a distant rushing sound was heard, which caused every man to spring to his feet, run out of the tent, and seize his weapons.
"What can it be, Joe?"
whispered Dick, as they stood at the tent door, leaning on their rifles, listening intently.
"Dunno,"
answered Joe shortly. Most of the numerous fires of the camp had gone out, but the bright moon revealed the dusky forms of thousands of Indians, whom the unwonted sound had startled, moving rapidly about. The mystery was soon explained. The Indian camp was pitched on an open plain of several miles in extent, which took a sudden bend half a mile distant, where a spur of the mountains shut out the farther end of the valley from view. From beyond this point the dull rumbling sound proceeded. Suddenly there was a roar as if a mighty cataract had been let loose upon the scene. At the same moment a countless herd of wild horses came thundering round the base of the mountain and swept over the plain straight towards the Indian camp.
"A stampedo!"
cried Joe, springing to the assistance of Pim, whose favorite horses were picketed near the tent. On they came like a living torrent, and the thunder of 1,000 hoofs was soon mingled with the howling of hundreds of dogs in the camp, and the yelling of Indians as they vainly endeavored to restrain the rising excitement of their steeds. Henry and Dick stood rooted to the ground, gazing in silent wonder at the fierce and uncontrollable gallop of the thousands of panic-stricken horses that bore down upon the camp with the tumultuous violence of a mighty cataract. As the maddening troop drew nigh, the camp horses began to snort and tremble violently, and when the rush of the wild steeds was almost upon them, they became ungovernable with terror, broke their halters and hobbles, and dashed wildly about. To add to the confusion at that moment, a cloud passed over the moon and threw the whole scene into deep obscurity. Blind with terror, which was probably increased by the din of their own mad flight, the galloping troop came on, and, with a sound like the continuous roar of thunder, that for an instant drowned the yell of dog and man, they burst upon the camp, trampling over packs and skins, and dried meat, etc., in their headlong speed, and overturning several of the smaller tents. In another moment they swept out upon the plain beyond, and were soon lost in the darkness of the night, while the yelping of dogs, as they vainly pursued them, mingled and gradually died away with the distant thunder of their retreat. This was a stampedo, one of the most extraordinary scenes that can be witnessed in the western wilderness.
"Lend a hand, Henry,"
shouted Joe, who was struggling with a powerful horse.
"What's come over your brains, man? This brute'll git off it if you don't look sharp."
Dick and Henry both answered to the summons, and they succeeded in throwing the struggling animal on its side and holding it down until its excitement was somewhat abated. Pim had also been successful in securing his favorite hunter, but nearly every other horse belonging to the camp had broken loose and joined the whirlwind gallop. But they gradually dropped out, and before morning the most of them were secured by their owners. As there were at least 2,000 horses and an equal number of dogs in the part of the Indian camp which had thus been overrun by the wild mustangs, the turmoil, as may be imagined, was prodigious. Yet, strange to say, no accident of a serious nature occurred beyond the loss of several chargers. In the midst of this exciting scene there was one heart there which beat with a nervous vehemence that well nigh burst it. This was the heart of Dick Varley's horse, Charlie. Well known to him was that distant rumbling sound that floated on the night air into the fur trader's camp, where he was picketed close to Cameron's tent. Many a time he had heard the approach of such a wild troop, and often, in days not long gone by, had his shrill neigh rung out as he joined and led the panic-stricken band. He was first to hear the sound, and by his restive actions to draw the attention of the fur traders to it. As a precautionary measure they all sprang up and stood by their horses to soothe them, but as a brook with a belt of bushes and a quarter of a mile of plain intervened between their camp and the mustangs as they flew past, they had little or no trouble in restraining them. Not so, however, with Charlie. At the very moment that his master was congratulating himself on the supposed security of his position, he wrenched the halter from the hand of him who held it, burst through the barrier of felled trees that had been thrown round the camp, cleared the brook at a bound, and, with a wild, hilarious neigh, resumed his old place in the ranks of the free-born mustangs of the prairie. Little did Dick think, when the flood of horses swept past him, that his own good steed was there, rejoicing in his recovered liberty. But Crusoe knew it. Ay, the wind had borne down the information to his acute nose before the living storm burst upon the camp, and when Charlie rushed past with the long, tough halter trailing at his heels, Crusoe sprang to his side, seized the end of the halter with his teeth, and galloped off along with him. It was a long gallop and a tough one, but Crusoe held on, for it was a settled principle in his mind never to give in. At first the check upon Charlie's speed was imperceptible, but by degrees the weight of the gigantic dog began to tell, and after a time they fell a little to the rear. Then, by good fortune, the troop passed through a mass of underwood, and the line, getting entangled, brought their mad career forcibly to a close. The mustangs passed on, and the two friends were left to keep each other company in the dark. How long they would have remained thus is uncertain, for neither of them had sagacity enough to undo a complicated entanglement. Fortunately, however, in his energetic tugs at the line, Crusoe's sharp teeth partially severed it, and a sudden start on the part of Charlie caused it to part. Before he could escape, Crusoe again seized to the end of it, and led him slowly but steadily back to the Indian camp, never halting or turning aside, until he had placed the line in Dick Varley's hand. "Hallo, pup! Where have you been? How did ye bring him here?" exclaimed Dick, as he gazed in amazement at his foam-covered horse. Crusoe wagged his tail, as if to say, "Be thankful you've got him, Dick, my boy, and don't ask questions that you know I can't answer."
"He must have broke loose and jinned the stampedo,"
remarked Joe, coming out of the chief's tent at the moment.
"But tie him up, Dick, and come in, for we want to settle about starting tomorrow or the next day."
Having fastened Charlie to a stake, and ordered Crusoe to watch him, Dick re-entered the tent where the council had reassembled, and where Pee-eye-em, having, in the recent struggle, split the blue surtout completely up to the collar, so that his backbone was visible throughout the greater part of its length, was holding forth in eloquent strains on the subject of peace in general, and peace with the Blackfeet, the ancient enemies of the Shirry-dikas, in particular. Chapter 23. Of the Dog Crusoe and his Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 24. Plans and Prospects. Dick becomes homesick, and Henry metaphysical. The Indians attack the camp. A blow up. On the following day the Indians gave themselves up to unlimited feasting in consequence of the arrival of a large body of hunters with an immense supply of buffalo meat. It was a regular day of rejoicing. Upwards of 600 buffaloes had been killed, and as the supply of meat before their arrival had been ample, the camp was now overflowing with plenty. Feasts were given by the chiefs, and the medicine men went about the camp uttering loud cries, which were meant to express gratitude to the Great Spirit for the bountiful supply of food. They also carried a portion of meat to the aged and infirm who were unable to hunt for themselves, and had no young men in their family circle to hunt for them. This arrival of the hunters was a fortunate circumstance, as it put the Indians in great good humor, and inclined them to hold friendly intercourse with the trappers, who for some time continued to drive a brisk trade in furs. Having no market for the disposal of their furs, the Indians of course had more than they knew what to do with, and were therefore glad to exchange those of the most beautiful and valuable kind for a mere trifle, so that the trappers laid aside their traps for a time and devoted themselves to traffic. Meanwhile, Joe Blunt and his friends made preparations for their return journey.
"You see,"
remarked Joe to Henry and Dick, as they sat beside the fire in Pee-eye-em's lodge and feasted on a potful of grasshopper soup which the great chief's squaw had just placed before them.
"You see, my calculations is as follows. What with trapping beavers and hunting, we three have made enough to sod us up, and it likes us. In the Mustang Valley—"
"Ha!" interrupted Dick, remitting for a few seconds to the use of his teeth in order to exercise his tongue. "Ha, Joe, but it don't like me. What, give up a hunter's life and become a farmer? I should think not." "Bon!" ejaculated Henry, but whether the remark had reference to the grasshopper soup or the sentiment we cannot tell. "Well," continued Joe, commencing to devour a large buffalo steak with a hunter's appetite,
"you'll please yourselves, lad, as to that. But, as I was sayin', we've got a powerful lot of furs and a big pack of odds and ends for the Injuns we chance to meet with by the way, and powder and lead to last us a 12-month. Besides, 5 good horses to carry us and our packs over the plains. So if it's agreeable with you, I mean to make a bee line for the Mustang Valley. We're pretty sure to meet with Blackfeet on the way, and if we do, we'll try to make peace between them and the Snakes. I expect it'll be pretty well on for 6 weeks afore we git home, so we'll start tomorrow."
"Dat is fat will do, will," said Henry. "Will you please donate me one petit morsel of steak?" "I'm ready for anything, Joe," cried Dick. "You're a leader. Just point the way, and I'll answer for 2 of us following ye. Eh, won't we, Crusoe?" "We will," remarked the dog quietly. "How comes it," inquired Dick, "that these Indians don't care for our tobacco?"
"They like their own better, I s'pose," answered Joe. "Most all the Western Injuns do. They make it of the dried leaves of the sumac and the inner bark of the red willow, chopped very small and mixed together. They call this stuff kinnikinnick, but they like to mix about 1/4 of our tobacco with it. So Pee-eye-em tells me, and he's a good judge, the amount that redskin mortal smokes is uncommon."
"What are they doing yonder?" inquired Dick, pointing to a group of men who had been feasting for some time past in front of a tent within sight of our trio.
"Gonna sing, I think," replied Joe.
As he spoke, 6 young warriors were seen to work their bodies about in a very remarkable way, and give utterance to still more remarkable sounds, which gradually increased until the singers burst out into that terrific yell, or war whoop, for which American savages have long been famous. Its effect would have been appalling to unaccustomed ears. Then they allowed their voices to die away in soft, plaintive tones, while their action corresponded thereto. Suddenly the furious style was revived, and the men wrought themselves into a condition little short of madness, while their yells rung wildly through the camp. This was too much for ordinary canine nature to withstand, so all the dogs in the neighborhood joined in the horrible chorus. Crusoe had long since learned to treat the eccentricities of Indians and their curs with dignified contempt. He paid no attention to this serenade, but lay sleeping by the fire until Dick and his companions rose to take leave of their host, and return to the camp of the fur traders. The remainder of that night was spent in making preparations for setting forth on the morrow, and when, at gray dawn, Dick and Crusoe lay down to snatch a few hours' repose, the yells and howling in the Snake camp were going on as vigorously as ever. The sun had arisen, and his beams were just tipping the summits of the Rocky Mountains, causing the snowy peaks to glitter like flame, and the deep ravines and gorges to look sombre and mysterious by contrast, when Dick and Joe and Henri mounted their gallant steeds, and with Crusoe gambolling before, and the 2 pack horses trotting by their side, turned their faces eastward, and bade adieu to the Indian camp. Crusoe was in great spirits. He was perfectly well aware that he and his companions were on their way home, and testified his satisfaction by bursts of scampering over the hills and valleys. Doubtless he thought of Dick Varley's cottage, and of Dick's mild, kind-hearted mother. Undoubtedly, too, he thought of his own mother, Fan, and felt a glow of affection as he did so. Of this we feel quite certain. He would have been unworthy the title of hero if he hadn't. Perchance he thought of Grumps, but of this we are not quite so sure. We rather think, upon the whole, that he did. Dick, too, let his thoughts run away in the direction of home. Sweet word! Those who have never left it cannot, by any effort of imagination, realize the full import of the word home. Dick was a bold hunter, but he was young, and this was his first long expedition. Oftentimes, when sleeping under the trees and gazing dreamily up through the branches at the stars, he had thought of home, until his longing heart began to yearn to return. He repelled such tender feelings, however, when they became too strong, deeming them unmanly, and sought to turn his mind to the excitements of the chase. But latterly his efforts were in vain. He became thoroughly homesick, and, while admitting the fact to himself, he endeavored to conceal it from his comrades. He thought that he was successful in this attempt. Poor Dick Varley! As yet he was sadly ignorant of human nature. Henry knew it, and Joe Blunt knew it. Even Crusoe knew that something was wrong with his master, although he could not exactly make out what it was. But Crusoe made memoranda in the notebook of his memory. He jotted down the peculiar phases of his master's new disease with the care and minute exactness of a physician, and, we doubt not, ultimately added the knowledge of the symptoms of homesickness to his already well-filled stores of erudition. It was not until they had set out on their homeward journey that Dick Varley's spirits revived. And it was not until they reached the beautiful prairies on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, and galloped over the green sward towards the Mustang Valley, that Dick ventured to tell Joe Blunt what his feelings had been. "Do you know, Joe," he said confidently, reining up his gallant steed after a sharp gallop, "do you know I've been feeling awful low for some time past?"
"I know it, lad,"
answered Joe, with a quiet smile, in which there was a dash of something that implied he knew more than he chose to express. Dick felt surprise, but he continued, "I wonder what it could have been. I never felt so before."
"'Twas homesickness, boy," returned Joe.
"How do you know that?"
"The same way as I know most things, by experience and observation. I've been homesick myself once, but it was long, long agone."
Dick felt much relieved at this candid confession by such a bronzed veteran, and, the chords of sympathy having been struck, he opened up his heart at once to the evident delight of Henry, who, among other curious partialities, was extremely fond of listening to and taking part in conversations that bordered on the metaphysical, and were hard to be understood. Most conversations that were not connected with eating and hunting were of this nature to Henry. "Homesick!" he cried. "Which mean being sick of home? Ha! Dat is fat I am always be when I goes out on a day expedition. Oui, vraiment."
"I always packs up,"
continued Joe, paying no attention to Henry's remark.
"I always packs up and sots off for home when I gets homesick. It's the best cure. And when hunters are young like you, Dick, it's the only cure. I've knowed fellers almost die of homesickness, and I'm told that they do go under altogether sometimes."
"Gwanda!" exclaimed Henry. "Oui, I was all but die myself when I first tried to get away from home. If I have not get away, I not be here to day." Henry's idea of homesickness was so totally opposed to theirs that his comrades only laughed, and refrained from attempting to set him right.
"The first time I was took bad with it was in a country something like that,"
said Joe, pointing to the wide stretch of undulating prairie, dotted with clusters of trees and wandering streamlets that lay before them.
"I had been out about 2 months, and was making a good thing of it, for game was plenty, when I began to think somehow more than usual of home. My mother was alive then."
Joe's voice sank to a deep, solemn tone as he said this, and for a few minutes he rode on in silence.
Well, it grew wuss and wuss. I dreamed of home all night and thought of it all day, till I began to shoot bad, and my comrades was getting tired of me. So I says to them one night, says I give out, lads. I'll make tracks for the settlement tomorrow. They tried to laugh me out of it at first, but it was a no-go. So I packed up, bid them good day, and sot off alone on a trip 500 miles. The very first mile of the way back I began to mend, and before 2 days I was all right again.
Joe was interrupted at this point by the sudden appearance of a solitary horseman on the brow of an eminence not a half-mile distant. The three friends instantly drove their pack horses behind a clump of trees, but not in time to escape the vigilant eye of the red man, who uttered a loud shout which brought up a band of his comrades at full gallop.
"Remember, Henry," cried Joe Blunt, "our errand is one of peace."
The caution was needed, for in the confusion of the moment Henry was making preparation to sell his life as dearly as possible. Before another word could be uttered they were surrounded by a troop of about 20 yelling Blackfeet Indians. They were, fortunately, not a war party, and still more fortunately they were peaceably disposed, and listened to the preliminary address of Joe Blunt with exemplary patience, after which the two parties encamped on the spot, the council fire was lighted, and every preparation was made for a long palaver. We will not trouble the reader with the details of what was said on this occasion. The party of Indians was a small one, and no chief of any importance was attached to it. Suffice it to say that the pacific overtures made by Joe were well received. The trifling gifts made thereafter were still better received, and they separated with mutual expressions of goodwill. Several other bands, which were afterwards met with, were equally friendly, and only one war party was seen. Joe's quick eye observed it in time to enable them to retire unseen behind the shelter of some trees, where they remained until the Indian warriors were out of sight. The next party they met with, however, were more difficult to manage, and unfortunately blood was shed on both sides before our travelers escaped. It was at the close of a beautiful day that a war party of Blackfeet were seen riding along a ridge on the horizon. It chanced that the prairie at this place was almost destitute of trees or shrubs large enough to conceal the horses. By dashing down the grassy wave into the hollow between the two undulations, and dismounting, Joe hoped to elude the savages. So he gave the word, but at the same moment a shout from the Indians told that they were discovered.
"Look sharp, lads! Throw down the packs on the highest point of the ridge!"
cried Joe, undoing the lashings, seizing one of the bales of goods, and hurrying to the top of the undulation with it.
"We must keep 'em at arm's length, boys. Be alive! War parties are not to be trusted."
Dick and Henry seconded Joe's efforts so ably that in the course of 2 minutes the horses were unloaded, the packs piled in the form of a wall in front of a broken piece of ground, the horses picketed close beside them, and our three travelers peeping over the edge with their rifles cocked, while the savages, about 30 in number, came sweeping down towards them.
"I'll try to get 'em to the palaver," said Joe Blunt, "but keep your eye on 'em, Dick, and if they behave ill, shoot the horse of the leading chief. I'll throw up my hand as a signal. Mind, lad, don't hit human flesh till my second signal is given, and see that Henry don't draw till I get back to you."
So saying, Joe sprang lightly over the slight parapet of their little fortress, and ran swiftly out unarmed towards the Indians. In a few seconds he was close up with them, and in another moment was surrounded. At first the savages brandished their spears and rode round the solitary man, yelling like fiends, as if they wished to intimidate him. But as Joe stood like a statue, with his arms crossed, and a grave expression of contempt on his countenance, they quickly desisted, and drawing near, asked him where he came from, and what he was doing there. Joe's story was soon told, but instead of replying, they began to shout vociferously, and evidently meant mischief.
If the Blackfeet are afraid to speak to the Paleface, he will go back to his braves,"
said Joe, passing suddenly between two of the warriors and taking a few steps towards the camp. Instantly every bow was bent, and it seemed as if our bold hunter were about to be pierced by 100 arrows, when he turned round and cried,
"The Blackfeet must not advance a single step. The first that moves his horse shall die. The second that moves himself shall die."
To this the Blackfoot chief replied scornfully,
"The paleface talks with a big mouth. We do not believe his words. The Snakes are liars. We will make no peace with him."
While he was yet speaking, Joe threw up his hand. There was a loud report, and the noble horse of the savage chief lay struggling in death agony on the ground. The use of the rifle, as we have before hinted, was little known at this period among the Indians of the far West. Many had never heard the dreaded report before, although all were aware, from hearsay, of its fatal power. The fall of the chief's horse, therefore, quite paralyzed them for a few moments, and they had not recovered from their surprise when a second report was heard. A bullet whistled past, and a second horse fell. At the same moment there was a loud explosion in the camp of the Palefaces. A white cloud enveloped it, and from the midst of this a loud shriek was heard, as Dick, Henri, and Crusoe bounded over the packs with frantic gestures. At this the gaping savages wheeled their steeds round, and dismounted horsemen sprang on behind two of their comrades, and the whole band dashed away over the plains as if they were chased by evil spirits. Meanwhile Joe hastened towards his comrades in a state of great anxiety, for he knew at once that one of the powder horns must have been accidentally blown up.
"No damage done, boys, I hope," he cried on coming up.
"Damage!" cried Henri, holding his hands tight over his face. "Oh, oui, great damage! Mocha damage! Me two eyes be blowed out of their holes."
"Not quite so bad as that, I hope," said Dick, who was very slightly singed, and forgot his own hurts in anxiety about his comrade. "Let me see."
"My eye!"
exclaimed Joe Blunt, while a broad grin overspread his countenance.
"You've not improved your looks, Henri."
This was true. The worthy hunter's hair was singed to such an extent that his entire countenance presented the appearance of a universal frizzle. Fortunately the skin, although much blackened, was quite uninjured, a fact which, when he ascertained it beyond a doubt, afforded so much satisfaction to Henri that he capered about shouting with delight, as if some piece of good fortune had befallen him. The accident had happened in consequence of Henri having omitted to replace the stopper of his powder horn, and when, in his anxiety for Joe, he fired at random amongst the Indians, despite Dick's entreaties to wait, a spark communicated with the powder horn and blew him up. Dick and Crusoe were only a little singed, but the former was not disposed to quarrel with an accident which had sent their enemies so promptly to the right about. This band followed them for some nights, in hope of being able to steal their horses while they slept, but they were not brave enough to venture a second time within range of the death-dealing rifle. Chapter 24